Then the format of the next couple of hours is going to be that we ask each of the participants to start by reading a poem that helps them address the issues that they chose to focus on from the panoply of questions that we sent them. They're each going to make a statement following that, and then I'll ask them some questions. Then we'll have an opportunity for Q&A from the audience. And finally, we're going to close out with the panel participants reading one more poem each. Okay, so very exciting couple of hours, I think, between now and 5. Right, your seatbelts. So, you all have brochures, so again, I'm not going to go over everyone's bio. I'm going to tell you, though, about the questions, as I promised. So we asked everyone to consider, does your research address issues of form? What is your working definition of poetic form? What is African American and/or African diaspora poetry to you? Does it reside in particular forms? What's the future of research on African American and/or African diaspora poetics from your point of view? How do issues of race, gender, sexuality, and more connect with issues of form in your scholarship or in your own work as a poet? Are you a poet? If so, how does your work as a critic or scholar inform your work as a poet and/or vice versa? Whom do you consider your audience for your research and criticism? Whom do you consider your audience for your poetry? Do audiences differ for different projects? What have been your major artistic, intellectual, and cultural influences? And finally, the third rail of TILTS poets and scholars, what are the political, cultural, and artistic connotations of the terms formalist poetry and formalist criticism for you? What do you think the connotations should be, if different from what they now are? So, Alden Nielsen, I'd like to ask you to start.
I love that. Peter, Paul, and Mary used to call that first person once removed. He was talking about how on the airlines they're always saying, we would like to thank you for flying with us, but then they never.
But we can't.
Since we're reading a poem at each end, I'll be reading a poem at the other end that you'll see is in relationship to this. This is a poem by Amiri Baraka entitled Duncan Spoke of a Process. And the title reads into the first line. Duncan spoke of a process, and what I have learned of it to repeat. Repeated as a day will repeat its color. The tired sounds run off its bones. In me, a balance. Before that, what came easiest, from wide poles across the greenest earth. Eyes locked on where they could live, and whatever came from there, where the hand could be offered, like Gideon's young troops on their knees at the water. I test myself with memory. A live, bloody skeleton hung as softly as summer, sways like words' melody, as ugly as any lips or fingers stroking lakes, or flesh like a white, frightened scream. What comes closest is closest. Moving, there is a wreck of spirit, a heap of broken feeling. What was only love, or in those cold rooms, opinion. Still, it made color, and filled me as no one will, as even I cannot fill myself. I see what I love most and will not leave what futile lies I have. I am where there is nothing save myself, and go out to what is most beautiful. What some non-combatant Greek or soft Italian prince would sing. Noble friends, noble selves. And which one is truly to rule here? And what country is this? Excuse me.
Next one is Keith Leonard.
I'll read a poem by Thomas Sayers Ellis from his volume, The Maverick Room. It's called Marcus Garvey Vitamins. A. All us, we folk. Person, community first. Invent truth. B. No, he didn't. Yes, he did. Ain't English. You lying to me. C. Africa disagrees with subject-verb agreement. Aspect ratio. D. Widescreen whiteacre. Don't like it? Don't Pulitzer me. I stress less than landlessness. E. I break beat. I rhetorical strategy. I escape route. I, psych.
What do you have?
I'm going to read one of my own poems. My recent work has been on community and conversation, so this poem sort of speaks to that, but it also speaks to questions of affiliation that yesterday's panel was addressing in such fascinating ways. It's called Dead Poet in the Passenger Seat. Dickinson flickers beside me, a sepia projection in too few frames per second, an analog broadcast, broken as trees break light, discreet despite the slant rhyme of us. She's dazed by the persistence of her signal, but grows sharp as she plays with the radio knobs. She asks how I dream and conjure while I drive this carriage at such shuddering speed. Observes that I'm not alive to the blurred show at the roadside, plunge of hawk for carrion, stem staggering under sea. She warns, slow down. I carry on about parallel routes, the map I might have used. Her image goes snowy, faintly doubled. I ask if she regrets her fine-stitched silences. Thinking of words, she slants forward, as if against wind, and wrings her hands. She says, oh yes, I do. Too many friends were ghosts, or I a ghost to them. But glancing at her eyes for just one attentive moment, I glimpse the no, joyous, the banked-up fire of her bound-up hair. Her dash protracts, each inky line sizzles like a telephone wire, connected the old way, alone.
Joshana, Liz?
So I'm going to be reading a selection from Sharon Bridgeforth's work, Love Conjure Blues.
Oh, yeah.
We as peoples born to violence, not our making and not our choosing, just the world we came to, fighting like animals leashed in a pen, maimed if we don't win, killed if we don't fight. So we've been perfecting, fighting to win the whole of our time here. Does that mean sorry? No, thankfully it's mine. So we've been perfecting, fighting to win the whole of our time here. And though violence is not our first nature, sometimes violence boils the blood, explodes in the veins. Sometimes violence shows up unexpected and just claims a nigga. See, what had happened was, one night, Biddy Fawn walked up on Nigger Red over to King Creole's Catfish Cafe. Apparently, Nigger Red's woman, Peachy Sunye, been tipping around with Biddy for years, and nobody had a clue. Fact is, it wasn't the kind of thought most likely to cross a mind, as it was not an understood possibility or yearned for idea. Well, maybe some folk had the yearning, but anyway. See, Biddy and Peachy both what you call long nail girls. Each one primp and fuss over their hair, outfits, lipstick and nails, shoes, shape and such and all, and well, we think of them two fluffing up for a trouser, woman, or man, or both. But nobody figured they'd been given attention to one the other. After all, how on earth could two primpers work out all the mirror time necessary to start the day? Well, I guess they proved our minds was real small, not real smart at all. I have one other little selection, and I'll stop. They met over a poem they wrote in the fields, between the digging of earth, the laying of tracks, the crossing of lines, between the pounding of steel and sun with battered spirit, in open spaces with no silence. They made poetry one syllable at a time. They conjured themselves, love. Kiss me, miss you, wish I, touch me, hold you now. I need your love. Will you be my baby? This is how Booker Change and Joshua Davis found each other. In blistering sun, working days never ending, back spent in toil. In the company of men, they claimed themselves. They claimed each other, declared themselves, adorned each other with words, united in heart. Booker Change and Joshua Davis married one the other with a poem. Love you, live with me, love you, live with me, my man, for all time, for all time. I'm yours, I'm yours. They quit the rails, opened shop, selling charms and things right there in their front yard. they get poetry for free. And even us that make our own charms stop by, because some days you just need a poem.
Roger Reeves.
So this was a really difficult process to figure out what poem to sort of frame so many of these questions. So I'm going to read God is an American by Terrence Hayes in this book, Lighthead. God is an American. I still love words. When we make love in the morning, your skin damp from a shower, the day calms. Schadenfreude may be the best way to name the covering of adulthood, the powdered sugar on a black shirt. I am alone now on the top floor, pulled by obsession, the ink on my fingers. Sometimes what I feel has a difficult name. Sometimes it is like the world before America, the kinship of God's fools and guardians, of hooligans, the dreams of mothers with no children. A word can be the boot print and a square of fresh cement in the glaze of morning. Your response to my kiss, I have a cavity. I am in love with incompletion. I'm clinging to your moorings. Yes, I have a pretty good idea of what beauty is. It survives all right. It aches like an open book. It makes it difficult to live.
Thank you so much for all of those words. So Alden, let's start with you. What did you want to say?
Actually,
sorry.
we're going to plug Alden into the projector.
So let's go with Roger.
Before diagnosis, the lake is dead for a second time this January. And no matter how many geese lay their warm breast against the ice or fly across its hard chest, it doesn't break or sink or open up and swallow them. The ice is frozen water. There is no metaphor for exile. Even if these trees continue to shake the crows from their branches, my sister is still farther away from her mind than we are from each other, sitting on opposite ends of a park bench, waiting for the evening to swallow us. And the last moments of a depressive, a sun. And the last moments of a sun, my sister says a man is chasing a goose through the snow. In this next series of poems, what I'm trying to do sort of in this scholarly presentation is present what I believe should be the framework for poems, which is other poems. I think that too often we want to frame our scholarly conversation with Marx or Adorno and things like that, and that's fine. I think there's a place for that, but I also think that there's a way in which poems provide their own philosophical framework, their own sort of their own conversations with sort of the socio-political situation. So that's sort of the way I'm setting this up. So, and I'm also interested, we always talk about this when, in poetry workshops and in craft workshops, when we talk about the book and how one poem is speaking to the next poem, and I'm trying to sort of think about that too. And so these poems are lined up in a way that sort of they're in conversation with each other. Cross country. When I ran, it rained niggers. Early in October, the first creases of autumn, a flag-weary sky in which yellow birds in flight slip through the breastbone of God and tear at the coarse threads that keep the morning knit tightly around his heart. What was it that they sang about the light? Their tongues, the thistles they pluck from the bitter bark of an all-thorn, then thrust into the breast of whatever God or good morning requires eating, a good piercing. These blonde bodies thrashing about above me were death's idea of the morning passing. Here, below this golden altar, the making and unmaking of my body, the kettle plank and souring sumac of a man yelling at the light slipping in and out of my mouth. What name must I carry above the dust of this field? Bruised ear, blank body, purple tongue, bloody God bleeding, do you hear me? Deer piss and poison ivy made pungent by the dew and morning sun rising, do you hear me? When I ran, it rained niggers. In a ditch along the road, a pair of wild boars slain and laid tusk to tail point. as if required, in two directions at once, toward my body, pressing the last bits of a hunter's moon into the tar of this road and away from the meadow red light coming up through the chaff, rising above this hectared field, and the man yelling, nigger, and the cicadas tuning up to tear the morning into tatters. Nigger, and the squawk and clatter of a hen complaining of a hand reaching below her bottom and removing the warm work of a cold night. Nigger, in the reeds covering the muck of a beaver's hard birth. Nigger, in the blue hour of a field once wet with the breath of a lone horse cracking along its flanks. Nigger, in the fog lifting from this field, in the stillbirth it reveals. Nigger, in the running, in the bog at the end of this road, in the war and in between the wars. Nigger, in the pink salt and eyelashes of a woman I love, her mouth pulling water from behind my knee, pulling, pulling, pulling. Think, nigger is the God of our brief salvation. Nigger in a body falling toward a horizon, nigger in the twilight that is no longer a twilight, but a black creek fumbling along the spine of a boy who is running through a city that is running out of water. Even the lions have left for the mountains. This is America speaking in translation, in glitter, in gold grills and fried chicken. Auto-tune this if you must. Cher will be singing in the brush of static from the attic radio, believing in love after love or life after love, despite the impure thoughts of evening. Despite the rain soaking the red head of a red bird, now dead in a puddle that refuses to reflect the moon. The Mayor of Money for Emmett Till. Another dead mare waits in the shoals of some body of water. Waits to be burdened, born into a foaming ocean where it might become food for whales or simply empty signifier. Hair latched to the sea's undulation like Absalom's beauty, caught in the playful branches of a tree desiring union, entanglement, thick confusion. But not this mare. She does not get the luxury of a lyric, a song that makes our own undoing or killing sweet, even as we go down into the fire to rise as smoke. This horse must lie, eyes open amongst the stone and freshwater crawfish in Money, Mississippi. She must listen to the men's boots break the water as they drop a black boy's body near her head, then pick him up only to let him fall there again, bent and eye to eye with her, as though decaying is something that requires a witness. As though the mayor might say, on Tuesday after the rain fell, the boy's neck finally snapped from the weight of the gin fan. He never looked at me again. Or the boy might say, no more. They part here, the boy's body carried back to town by another, as the horse stays, says nothing, because horses don't speak. Besides, this one's dead. Self-portrait is love in Mississippi. In Tupelo, Mississippi, cows forget their manners and mount each other out of season despite frost stitching the split between their hooves, settling on their coarse hides and then cracking like a face below a boy's skate when they tuck and tuck and tuck, the hook and bowl of their hips measured in sweat, then frost sealing each leg hair into tiny spears that clatter against each other. We all understand these spears carried along our legs from a lover's bed back to a field or barn or cupboard where roaches clip breast to armored back atop a bag of uncooked black eyes. Oh, these spears of love running along our legs, sometimes hanging from the sides of our mouths, and long, heavy ropes, like the saliva falling from these cows' mouths, forcing them to carry their heads just above the mud as they turn from each other's sated body. God bless this forgetting, and the javelins we sink into each other's sides. And I'll just read two more. It's called Parable of the Blade of Grass. Where the fire enters a city of small doors, a city of one blade of grass, a city where the fire enters, where the children lick the stones of the street on their hands and knees, and the mice gather in the square with the others to watch the one blade of grass, where the old men whisper in their hands, a city where the old women move their skirts against their thighs to remind themselves of their own flesh and what flesh can do for a city, for a fire, where a couple not from the city, not blue veined but full of flesh, watch the town gather around the blade of grass. Watch them offer their eyes. Watch them heap stones around their fire. This couple not from this city, not flattened by the heat nor the dust. Watch the children crawl to the edge of the blade of grass and offer their young tongues. In this city where the fire enters, the two not of the city walk till the children step over their hunchbacks and dirt-stained lips, past the edge and pluck the flower from the fire from this city, in this city where fire moves through a hush of flesh. The couple not of the city snaps the blade of grass in two and place it in each other's mouths. Watch them eat a fire. Watch the children grow legs below the knees. Watch the old men kiss the old women behind the house walls. Love is when you hear the flood coming. And the last poem I will read is called Someday I'll Love Roger Reeves. It's actually a line from Frank O'Hara. He has this great poem, and like the last stanza, he just says, "Someday I'll love Frank O'Hara." And I thought, oh, that's it. Someday I'll love Roger Reeves. Until then, let us have our gods and short prayers, our obligations, our thigh bone connected to our knee bone, our dissections and our swans, our legs gashed upon a barbed wire fence and our heels tucked behind a lover's knees. Let us have a stalk of sugarcane to suck and another to tear our backs with what it knows of disaster and a tadpole's folly. Let us have mistakes and fish willing to come to a bell rung across a body of water. Let us have our drawbridges and our moats, our heavens no higher than a pile of dried leaves. Let us have irrelevance and a scalpel, a dislocated ankle, and 3 more miles to run. A plastic bottle to hold nothing but last names and a chill. If none of this will be remembered, then let us keep speaking with tongues light as screen doors clapping shut on a child's finger. For this is love, to press one frame against another, and when something like a finger is found between this pressing, to press nevertheless. For this is our obligation. Let us forget our obligations. For this is love. Let us forget our love. Our eyelids' needs for beginnings and ends and blood. Our coils of hunger that turn another into dried honey on our hands. And what if this goes on forever? Our hours, our drafts and fragments, our blizzards and our cancers. Then let us hold each other toward heaven and forget that we were once made of flesh, that this is the fall our gods refuse to clean with fire or water. Thank you.
Roger Reeves right now. So Alden, are you ready?
Well, we're about to find out. Can you turn on the
Let's get the
turn on the machine and drop the screen, and we'll find out if this is going to work or not.
Okay.
I have to go to the back to show you these things, and then I'll come back up here and talk a little bit about what's going on here.
Look at that.
Every dog has a day. Monday is my day, even if it is blue. Come track on Tuesday, that's my day too. Wednesday, go to meeting, sing, pray Lord, try to get happy and get away. Thursday, Eagle Friday, and all the weekends. I'm tripping. Listen, friend. Every day is my day. Just for me. Just like it is for you.
We don't have time to do the whole thing, but I want you to know that's the Texas Southern University Jazz Ensemble.
Wow.
And I wanted you to see these pictures because even those of you who knew Lorenzo Thomas never saw the, except for Harry, never saw the 1972 Lorenzo Thomas song. Yes. That picture is, as it says, from Dayton, Ohio, where he was attending one of the first Paul Lawrence Dunbar festivals. And if we had time, I also have a recording of him reading Dunbar. But we don't have time. So, I'm going to leave you looking at the quite dapper Lorenzo Thomas in 1972. Actually, let me show you just a couple other things. For years, Patrick Spivak used to show up at conferences, and she would always have this big notebook, and she would talk about what she would talk about, had a good time. In the longer version of this, I will be talking about this at AWP in Chicago. I talk about the visual elements of Lorenzo Thomas's publications, particularly the works he did with his brother Cecilia, partly getting at this idea of not just the visual in the poetry, but the idea of not just the phrasing of the poem that literally in this case looks back at you, well, also a lot of the sign, but also the sort of Afrofuturist mode that we also find in things like art ensemble Chicago and their Sylvan Great Black Music Future. This combination of the idea of ancient civilizations and futuristic work within work like sound science. But now I'm going to go up here and read a couple pages to you. And if Lisa will let me know when I have approximately 60 seconds left, that would be really helpful. And then perhaps in the discussion part, we can explain what any of this had to do with the questions that we were actually asked, other than the fact that Lorenzo Thomas came to Texas in the 70s and stayed. Quote, through a park, then I cross St. Nicholas, 8th Avenue, 7th, and I come to the Y, the Harlem Branch Y, where I take the elevator up to my room, sit down, and write this page, unquote. Now these lines with their perambulating persona making his way through those very same Negro streets traversed at the outset of Ginsberg's Howl sound like nothing, Roger, so much as one of Frank O'Hara's I Do This, I Do That poems. Or perhaps the product of one of O'Hara's many progeny among the New Yorkish poets of the post-World War II years. The poem is, of course, neither one. It's Hughes's theme for English B. One component of his montage of A Dream Deferred, first published in a 1949 issue of Common Ground. In our zeal to school our poets, we often seem doomed to repeat the de facto segregation of those days. Hence, Langston Hughes is seldom spoken of as any kind of a New York school poet, though he's often deemed a Harlem poet and was already called a Harlem poet while living in Washington, D.C. We arrange our poets into coteries as often as we group them by aesthetic leanings. Thus, a stage full of poet contemporaries in New York in the early 1960s would easily, and did in fact, accommodate Beat, Black Mountain, and New York school poets, all of whom were close friends, indeed belonged to the same coterie. The village apartment of Leroy and Hetty Jones in the days before he became Imamu Amiri Baraka was a gathering of just those groups, as was Jones Baraka himself. O'Hara read Hughes, as had Baraka, and they all went to the 5 spot and held their breath. Quote, you know, I keep coming back to the Crown Delicatessen. It reminds me of you. I see your happy face at every blonde table, my red, embarrassed smirk in the edges of beer bottles, the irresponsible public hero above the stainless steel takeout counter. My picture is in that cheap frame, and you are that first dollar pasted on the mirror. I've been so busy of late, translating 2 or 3 chants by Leopold Senghor and thinking about the coming revolution, end quote. These lines are not Hughes, not O'Hara, or a New York school of Phoebe, not Baraka. That's an early poem by the then New York poet Lorenzo Thomas, dating to 1964, and foregrounding many of the surface features that could and perhaps should be seen as linking poets of the new American poetry across racial and coterie boundaries. By this time, Don Allen's New American Poetry is out and has been read by the younger poets of Thomas's generation. Baraka's preface to a 20-volume suicide note has become a touchstone among many on the aesthetic left, and the casual, attitudinal, gestural poetics here visible have become a taken-for-granted part of the vocabulary, the toolkit of innovative poets. Gathering with his mostly older colleagues in the Society of Umbra, those, what did you call them, Harriet, slumming Umbra alums, alums, Thomas was learning as much from the highly distinctive aesthetics of Lloyd Addison, another New York poet, as he was from O'Hara or Baraka. Like O'Hara and like Hughes, who translated many of them, Thomas was reading the small presses to see what the poets in Ghana and elsewhere in Africa were doing. But here too, there was an element of racialized perception that Thomas was reading and dealing with. The poem I've been quoting, The Unnatural Life, opens with a telling epigraph from Aimé Césaire. Quote, what I am is a man alone, imprisoned in white. Thomas's poem takes a turn not found anywhere in O'Hara, though pointed to in works like the 1959 Personal poem, that poem in which Baraka brings O'Hara news of the beating of Miles Davis by the New York police. Quote, my copy of Muhammad Speaks covers the table and the wind and the door hanging open, frightened because I am here, that I might forget these young delusions of love. Afraid as I emerge from my fashionable jacket, my brain turns black and hateful, like a beast, your color rising in my nose, and you are raped and murdered in the usual manner. The same peach tree in the backyard spreads on the White House behind your house. It is a simplified heart. See the blind aorta sketched over the vacant windows. I should never have moved into your neighborhood. How we doing?
You have about 90 seconds.
90 seconds. The invocation of that White House behind your house points back to the Harlem Renaissance and the Claude McKay poem titled variously, with and without his permission, The White House and White Houses, while at the same time reaching further back still to Charles Chestnut's The House Behind the Cedars. The more violent imaginings of the poem parallel elements of Baraka's black art, Black Dot and Neolismus, Poem for Black Hearts, and other contemporaneous works, but with an ironic edge Baraka was somewhat de-emphasizing along with his family name. That final line of Thomas's poem is a send-up of anti-integrationist logics in an era that still saw redlining, blockbusting, and various government-sponsored means of ensuring de facto segregation. I always remember a cartoon of the day that showed a beer-bellied, unshaven slob of a white man sitting on his porch wearing what my students now call a wife beater. I've never had heard that. Watching a besuited African-American man moving his tastefully attired family into the house across the street and commenting to his wife, "There go the property values." It was a raisin in the sun era when even poets could get a laugh out of neighborhood race boundaries. Thomas's line additionally may be read as a satiric commentary on the increasingly integrated bohemian art scene of New York's Lower East Side in those days, as Umbra's artists moved into formerly ethnic enclaves. If one wanted to be a poet in the early 60s, and here's where you see a real transformation from the time in which Lorenzo Thomas begins writing to the time in which most of us begin writing. If one wanted to be a poet in the early 60s, Thomas wrote later for African American Review, the Lower East Side was the place to be. And the place to be at 2 in the morning if you were an Umbra poet was the Polish Cafe Stanley's at 13th Street and Avenue B, which quickly became a gathering ground for poets and other artists and was a bit later the birthplace of the Fugs. Then too, the line may be seen as addressing another sort of mixing that was going on at Stanley's as Ishmael Reed, Tom Dent, Lorenzo Thomas, and the other Umbra alums rubbed elbows with white artists, including Aldo Tambellini, who operated a storefront studio and gallery space nearby at $65 a month rent in those days, and who was later to marry Umbra poet N.H. Pritchard's ex-wife. Black poets had entered the aesthetic neighborhoods of the new American poetry, had in fact helped bring them into being, though, as with residential neighborhoods, they were slow to be accepted in the anthology districts of American verse. That seems like a good place to start. We can turn off the picture, but I guess it doesn't hurt anything.
I'm just going to turn on the light so
that works.
you can read your notes. Keith, you want to go next?
Sure. Oops, sorry. I'm Facebook friends with Thomas Sayers Ellis. It's not a major distinction, but on one of his posts, I saw him have a conversation with a poet in which he said something like the following, quote, "I cannot predict the new thing, but I know that when it comes, I will hate it." I found this to be a useful piece of wisdom, confronted with the next generation's vision, now called post-soul or post-ethnic or post-black. I found that I expect to find many things wrong with it. I find that this post-black discourse to be particularly challenging because it threatens a lot of the things that I've taken for granted in the relationship between blackness and poetry. I thought of blackness as a reservoir of ethnic identity heritage out of which various kinds of poetic forms and expression come. Thus, as I seek in my current scholarship to comprehend the nature and function of formal innovation in contemporary poets, especially as a legacy of the Black arts movement of the 1960s, I have come to recognize that all of this posterizing, as scholar Hall Taylor called it, all this posterizing provides a useful challenge to my settled thinking about blackness and poetics. As much as I happily embrace the multiplicity of blackness that post-black tries to emphasize, I find myself wanting my blackness to be not all that open. And I'm not sure that post-black has taken on as much of a life in poetics as it has in visual art, but why not? Especially given the impressive range of poetic choices, formal choices among contemporary poets, including the poets who were on the panel yesterday. So that as I considered my answers to the question about the future of African American poetic studies and what is African American diasporic poetics, I found myself considering a more open definition of each, blackness and poetics, than I had anticipated. As I said, I've considered it a truism of African American poetic scholarship that we examine the relationship between formal choices and this reservoir of cultural heritage, form, and language practice and political positions that we call blackness. And that this black identity formation becomes the ties that both bind and liberate black poets. But again, the multiplicity of formal choices in contemporary poets seems to trouble this relationship between what I've been used to being called blackness and new ways of thinking about poetic form. I'm not yet prepared to call this new thing post-black, and I'll get back to that in a moment. I prefer Evie Shockley's phrase, the new black, with all of its delicious irony. But one of the newnesses of this blackness is an increased porousness of boundaries between black and other forms, as Alden was just talking about. Another is to think about its tendency, like the little black dress, to go in and out of fashion. So poetic newness has as much to do with cross-racial poetic knowledge as with black vernacular culture. So it seems to me that black poetic form needs to have, I hate to say this, a new dress. Let me explain another term, please. Post-black is just the most belligerent version of an intriguing rethinking of the relationship between heritage as a defining category of ethnic poetics. For example, we're used to the jazz blues tradition as being one way of talking about what black poetic form is. Black vernacular language is another, call and response is a third. But post-black, especially in the visual arts, stakes its claim on resistance to many of these aspects of what some of them might call the kind of overly pious dependence on this black vernacular culture. They reject some of this form as well as the ethos attached to it. There's an irreverence about the necessity to represent blackness positively or even to represent it at all. Authenticity has long been critiqued and dismissed, and some of these artists don't even feel the need to take it seriously. And there's as much of a self-conscious critique of in-group racial dynamics as a critique of racism or an affirmation of black identity. If one is no longer beholden to these usual pieties of black vernacular cultural affirmation and about taboo terms of representation, think of Carol Walker's Silhouettes, one has a vaster field of artistic possibilities in terms of identification. To this extent, this contemporary adventurousness, I think, is to the good. And African American poets have in fact been pursuing these kinds of irreverent terrain for a long time now without feeling the need to call it post-black, a declaration of independence from the black past. But it seems to me that there's a powerful couple of consequences to this adventurousness that maybe will inform conceptions of African American poetics very soon. First, generational change, whether post-black or not, has created a kind of individualism, for lack of a better term, whose irreverence treats communal identity sometimes as a limitation, as a holdover from the traumas of the long ago past, no longer felt as vividly or no longer as vividly imagined. So, for example, I asked students in my class a couple weeks ago to name their ethnic identity, talk about a couple of characteristics of it, and one of the students said he's of the post-civil rights generation, and he doesn't care what white people think of him. For him, the white gaze is no longer laden with the hangman's noose. Touré's book, Who's Afraid of the New Post-Blackness, which I haven't read all the way, he makes a similar observation that if you're no longer so close to the traumas of that past, you don't feel as much of the sense of obligation or loyalty, and so you feel that your blackness can be created by your individual choices. He also adds the point that black culture is now so definitively part of American popular culture that it's not about defining black people exclusively anymore anyway. So there's a second consequence that emerges from this first one, namely that the heritage of cultural forms, jazz, the blues, spirituals, black vernacular language, the dozens, etc., may no longer frame what it means to articulate blackness in verse. Another way to put it is to observe that a common move among scholars of identifying black poetics, aside from the ethnic identity of the author, is to place poems in relationship to that heritage and other poems of that heritage, and to talk about the traumas of racism and to talk about various political postures those poets take. But if blackness itself becomes less constrained by this sense of trauma, this sense of heritage, this sense of history, then maybe blackness itself is one of those traditional forms, like the sonnet, potentially constraining. Now we know that many of our poets have done fascinating, beautiful, wonderful things with the sonnet, or other stanzas like the ballad stanza, etc. So it's not simply that, ideologically speaking, it's a white form and black poets have to be trapped in it. But nonetheless, what if we rethink of blackness as a traditional form, or certain terms of blackness as traditional forms to be innovated? What does this mean for potentially for contemporary formal innovation? I have to confess here that this might be more a question for scholars than poets, especially as Roger says, poets might imagine framing poetic conversations with other poems as opposed to these scholarly concerns. But that said, if you were here yesterday, you know that the poets had very open conceptions of form. One person talked about embodiedness. Another mentioned that the limitations of a poem's form are the page and language itself. Others talked about structure, a tension between structure and form. The freedom of these questions seems to me to be very powerful, but it resists my temptation, at least, and I think other scholars' temptations of tagging verse as black or white or what have you. What do these ethnic labels mean if there aren't specific forms attached to them? What do these ethnic labels mean if the forms themselves are questioning how we think of the ethnicity itself? If there are no black forms and no authentic black identity, what is African diaspora poetry? I'm not ready to deconstruct blackness, so let me be clear about that. I think that what this has made clear for me is that while I'm prepared to talk about what formal innovation is, and I imagine my scholarship to do so, I don't have a working definition of what black poetic form might be. And I think the question that it brings up to me is, how are poets today imagining the relationship between their formal choices and whatever they might mean at a given moment by blackness? And I think some of the same things obtain: vernacular culture, certain political postures and experiences that are colored by the color of one's body and how that body is read. But because there's a wider array of formal choices being made, that question becomes more complicated than I had approached it with. And I find this to be a very winning thing. So let's not call it post-black. Let's call it the new black. And let's talk about what all these different forms of expression might mean if we're talking about black poetics.
Thank you so much. Leslie Wheeler.
Yes, I'm going to briefly describe 2 or 3 projects that I've been working on and how they intersect with all these wonderful questions that Lisa and Maida dreamed up for us. My brain is still sort of hovering over the Pacific, making its slow way to Virginia, because I spent most of the first half of 2011 in New Zealand. I was lucky enough to win a Fulbright. What I was researching there is ideas of community in contemporary poetry, and particularly negotiations between the local and transnational affiliations among poets. And what I learned, reading intensively in contemporary New Zealand poetry is the most thinking that I've been doing about race and poetry lately has been, in that geography, and thinking about the relationship between Maori and Pacific poetry in New Zealand and what would usually be called Pākehā poetry, which basically means non-Maori, but especially poetry by people of European descent. And the situation there is not good. There was for a while very, very strong mentorship of Maori and Pacific Island poets by Albert Wendt and Witi Ihimaera, who were at the University of Auckland, who have recently retired. And they enabled and empowered and encouraged so many writers coming through that it's incredibly moving to talk to the generations of students that they had. But they have retired, and what's taken their place is a graduate program in creative writing that is much more focused on the Northern Hemisphere, on relationships between New Zealand and Australia, but mostly New Zealand and the U.S. and England, Britain. So there's a real gap there. I mean, there are only 2 Maori poets of the sort of middle generation in the 30s and 40s. Only 2 have books. I recommend both of them strongly, Robert Sullivan and Hina Moana Baker. But they're people who are struggling to find places in the most powerful institutions there. And the graduate programs that people are working through are, sometimes really destructive, in fact, to writers who are just coming through. English department, for example, only has one poet or one member in the department of Maori descent, and the racial politics are really ugly, you know, to the point where like people go out to lunch and don't invite her, you know, to the point where she's moved her office to the Maori and Pacific Studies building because at least people are friendly there. So, you know, it was a place that was really tough, you know, to kind of learn what was happening and see that a lot of the most exciting stuff was happening in, particularly among Maori and Samoan poets who are struggling to get access to publication and to the resources that are mostly dominated by Pakeha poets and mostly by male poets as well. So that's been really interesting to work through, and you know, there are a lot of different ways to think about what community might mean, what networks might mean for poets, and you know, going back to what Roger was saying, conversations among poets and among people, and what they eventually mean for the poetry that gets produced and gets out there in the world. But certainly, one of the crossovers for me is thinking about not only, you know, the conversations I'm having as somebody who lives in a rural place in Virginia, the conversations I'm having electronically with people in different countries all over the world, but also thinking about, well, the poetry that I'm writing right now. I've got a manuscript that's sort of coming together called Signal to Noise, at least that's the working title. And it's about transmission and reception and all those things. But I do find that while I'm writing about the importance of networks and communities and conversation, the poems tend to be about refusals of communication. That poem, Dead Poet in the Passenger Seat, that I read, I keep writing poems about being introverted and not wanting to talk to anybody. So the other thing, the other project is one that I just recently published. It's an essay you can find online in the Kenyon Review Online. And it's about rhyme and gender in contemporary poetry. And it came partly, you know, I'm kind of a rhyme nerd. I'm I'm always collecting different kinds of rhyme and thinking about how they work and what that chime means. You know, macaronic rhyme and para-rhyme and anagrammatic rhyme, and that's Kay Ryan's term. But I was thinking about the presence of poetry in received forms in literary journals. And I had the impression, both as a reader of those journals and as somebody who was submitting, that the poems that used rhyme were the hardest sell. And so, you know, I went through and I did some counting exercises, and it was, you know, on a small scale, very unscientific. But what I found is, not surprisingly, that poetry in rhyme is not in fashion. Like there's tons, you know, I hear it, I've heard it certainly in the poems that have been read here in the past day or two. It's not just end rhyme, right? Like there's a ton of chiming sound and eternal rhyme in contemporary poetry. That's one of the main devices that holds poems together sonically, and you know, it's there all over the place. But end rhyme in predictable patterns, you know, it's not really out there, or not much. My counting did show me that, so the proportions of people publishing end-rhymed poems in magazines is fairly small, and it's smaller for women. Even, I mean, most literary magazines, they typically have a heavy bias that they usually publish mostly male poets. So there's usually the gender difference is pretty striking. But even accounting for that, the proportion of women publishing rhyme poems seems small. And you know, that's not scientific. I'd have to really do a much broader survey to see if that's really true. But I think that's interesting. And the essay sort of makes some strange moves, because in that essay I'm also thinking about clothing I'm thinking about outer edges, basically. And so it's an essay about going to scholarly conferences and poetry conferences and watching how people present themselves, and you know, what scholars are supposed to look like in certain contexts, and how they accessorize. And yeah, it's endlessly kind of interesting. Yeah, I've gotten some really interesting fan mail. From the essay. But you know, certainly something that's been a big issue for me is that I came through and credentialed as a scholar. I've got the PhD. Fought much harder. I had to fight for a network there because my dissertation advisors kind of, well, bad things happened to them. So, you know, I did fight for a network as a scholar, but as a poet more so, you know, fighting my way in felt a little harder. You know, that the essay is kind of about negotiating those things and how you find yourself present in academic conferences where your affiliations are my affiliations have been with feminist scholars who work on innovative poetries. Those are the people who were incredibly generous to me from the outset and have helped me. My poetic affiliations are often with poets working in usually interested, kind of twisty ways with received forms. And I find, you know, that there's this incredible intellectual tension between the belonging to those two communities and feeling like in one community that I have to hide my association with the other. So the essay kind of negotiates those things. So I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Okay, so I wanted to use the selection I read from Sharon Bridgeforth, her work, as a means through which to address some of the questions that were given to us today. The selection, as I read from Love Conjure Blues, and I guess I need to admit that in some sense I disobeyed instruction by not picking a poem, a particular poem, and instead picking something that's called, that Bridgeforth refers to as a performance novel, something that doesn't really fit into a particular form necessarily, so I was a little disobedient.
Yeah.
But what's interesting about Love Conjure Blues,
we hate hearing Sharon Bridgeforth.
I assume this audience would hear. But Love Conjure Blues claims for itself the qualities of poetry, performance, and the novel. The value of Bridgeforth's work is that it makes the reader conscious about questions of form and generic distinction by existing in between these. And I offer up the elements that I read from the Love Conjure Blues as my poem, my contribution, not to lock the piece into one generic mode, but rather to interrogate the possibilities of the mode and what fits into this category. And I think importantly for me, to think about how the question of the poetic or the poem-like fits into this discussion. It's not just the poem, but the poetic and the poem-like. Bridgeforth describes this piece, this long, what is in fact kind of meditation, as exploring a range of possibilities of gender expression and sexuality within a rural, Black, working-class context. She accomplishes this goal by portraying a large cast of men's, women's, some that is both, some that is neither. Not only through diction that reflects regional dialect, but also by manipulating the graphic presentation of the text. If you've seen it, you know that she uses all kinds of different fonts and sizes to manipulate the text graphically throughout the entire piece. So italicizing, using different fonts to signal shifts in character, attitude, and tone. The graphic and generic complexity of Bridgeforth's work is an expression of the positionality of the Black queer subject, which is her declared focus. Some of the graphic manipulations are kind of difficult to describe, and I think you only really appreciate it as a reader if you actually hold it in your hand and look at it. The second section I read about Booka and Josh, there's a shift from kind of regular text to italicized text, and from mostly monosyllabic lines, and to longer lines to monosyllabic lines for the most part. It was the love you, live with me, love you, live with me, like that section. That is the shifted section. The textual change marks the movement from a description of the men's relationship to a lyric interpretation of their vows, as well as a movement from third-person narration to first-hand account. here and throughout the text, prosaic moments transform into poetic moments, and all are contained in a work that the author insists is unceasingly performative. To reiterate, Bridgeforth is not only writing about men and women, but also the both and the neither. So she must adopt a formal practice that can convey this undermining or unsettling of social and personal boundaries. The graphic architecture of the language houses and delineates this subject position. In other words, Bridgeforth's subject matter itself necessitates a manipulation of the form. My point is that the attention to queers of color here yields formal and generic experimentation. In addition, it is vital to keep in mind Bridgeforth. At the beginning, she has a little part where she kind of talks about what she's doing. She insists that the novel places a fiction form, and I'm saying a poeticized fiction form, inside an African-American voice. Her point is that she shapes the content and the structural elements by being attentive to an African-American register and material existence. Such attention to the African-American voice and its relationship to artistic practices, for me as a scholar, calls to mind actually a much earlier work that you might not readily connect Bridgeforth to. And I'm talking here about Sarah Webster Fabio's 1970 essay, Tripping with Black Writing. Fabio argues that artistic awareness of the structure of Black language has determined and must continue to inform Black artistic production. She calls for artists to employ what she terms Black perspective, Black aesthetic, Black rhetoric, and Black language in their works. As opposed to seeing this kind of call as being kind of limited and constraining, I want to put forth the idea that artists like Bridgeforth recognize that kind of the possibilities of such a focus, of thinking about Black language. You don't feel limited by it, but see the possibilities and the potentialities in it by really turning to it. However, Bridgeforth is not only concerned with the value of Black language. An interest in the social realities of the Black subject coincides with and enhances the organizing frame of the Black idiom. Recall the segment that I opened up with, we as peoples born to violence. I think this idea, and that it's not the very first line, but it's very, very early on in the text when you kind of the reader encounters that line, which is in bold. It becomes clear that throughout Love Conjure Blues, the Black bodies that populated face bodily harm and physical threats. There are descriptions of violence throughout the text, as when Biddy gets into altercation with Nigger Red over a shared woman, Peachy Sunye, who was mentioned in the selection. However, the speaker is not simply referencing the seemingly random occurrence of violence in the lives of the characters. Rather, she is charting the particularly Nigga experience of rarely having full control over one's life or one's body within the social matrix. Accordingly, Bridgeforth attempts to capture linguistic and experiential Blackness in her text, which defies, again, simple generic categorization. In fact, it is this social identity that is at stake in the textual performance of queerness. Blackness is an aesthetic strategy here, and is both the subject and the governing methodology. What I'm trying to think through here in my manuscript is the relationship between questions of form and considerations of positionality. Like really trying to think about how artists come to terms with thinking those two things together. And what I want to suggest to you today as a way to really try to get back to the initial questions is to think about form as a means of artistic translation, and that form is functioning as a kind of translation. And I really find this to be an apt metaphor because translations themselves, right, are never perfect. They're always approximations. And so artists who inhabits a form and is trying to get an idea across through that form will have necessarily, we just came yesterday, will have certain kinds of limitations, but the artist can still use that form to do what he or she wants to some extent. And I think, for me, if you think about form as through the lens of translation, I actually understand better what Bridgeforth is doing, why she has to kind of constantly be revising how she's using the text throughout the work, how she's constantly playing with the presentation. She keeps adapting the form almost on every single page, almost every single line to try to get across this idea, but the form itself in the text keeps kind of failing her. So she goes back and changes it again and again and again. And I think, for me, looking at this text helps me understand how form can function as a kind of, even if it's failing, even if it is imperfect, a kind of means of translation. One other point, and then I'll stop. Two other points. One point is, I think I tried to make this suggestion for my connection to Fabio. There's a way in which when you look at someone like Bridgeforth, I think you can see how the work is positioned in such a way that it is both kind of backward and forward looking, in a way that it can be capturing ideas of artists and writers who came before her and kind of manifesting them in different ways, but also in the kind of experimentation is necessarily, I think, looking forward to something else, something that it is not itself, but something that it sees coming. So I just like the idea of thinking about her in kind of both those directions. And the last piece, this isn't really a contention or idea, it's just a question. What I was struck with when thinking about the questions we were sent and thinking about kind of my comments on this work was the question of voice and the relationship between form and voice. And I really hope the poets have something where it can help me think through this. Because I guess the question I have is the extent to which voice is completely just dependent upon form, or voice itself is a kind of manifestation of form in some way. And I hope that doesn't seem simplistic or limiting in that. But it's a question I have that I'm kind of left with, thinking about the voice that Bridgeforth is trying to capture here, and thinking about how the idea of voice fits into what I'm doing here, what I'm doing in my my other work. And yeah, it's just a question. So I'll end with that question. Thanks.
I've been listening to this argument for a long time. Voice is a metaphor. It's always been a metaphor. When people talk about finding their voice, the worst thing to do is take that literally. Okay? When we talk about voice in writing, what we're talking about is what's on the page, what comes off the page when you're reading it. And of course, it's structural and formal. You may actually hear a poet's voice. And if you're like me, once you've heard that poet's speaking voice, you hear that every time you read their poem thereafter, which can be a wonderful thing or an annoying thing. It can be just about anything. The danger of this metaphor is that we become glued to it. And American poetry has very much become glued to this idea of the voice. I think, in fact, following on Jershan's question, if you think of it more the way he's suggesting, that voice is something that we create rather than that we find, you'll be in a much more productive space. At least in my own writing, that's what I found.
Yes, Keith.
And going along with what Alvin's saying and the metaphor of form as translation, one of the things that I like the metaphor of form as translation. One of the things that becomes complicated and sort of segues into my thinking is, what is it that's being translated? The notion that form is translation presumes there's a thing to be translated, and that thing remains constant, and that the changing of the form is her attempt to get at that same one thing that remains constant. And perhaps there is a thing that remains constant, queer positionality, that one wants to represent. But it seems, I'm interested in how some of the innovative poets talk about writing writing a poem as a making of something. And so if voice can be also a metaphor for how a poem comes off across the page, maybe that which is being translated does become translated, but it becomes translated into the form. And the changes in the form therefore change the thing which is being translated, which I think the worst thing for me as a scholar is to hear folks informed by Jacques Derrida and others to take that and say, therefore there's no there, and that's not what I'm interested in. But I'm interested in how the translation makes something as much as it's bringing something to the poem. And
I quickly say Derrida never said that either.
You said which?
That there's no there.
Right.
Lorraine.
But I'm really interested in addressing Jershan's question and what you just said, Keith. That very notion of blackness as the thing that remains constant. If the new black is that new framing, which I am so loving that presentation. But the very suggestion of that, the new black, is that the blackness is the thing that remains constant, because that is, the way that phrase is constantly being, used. Like the new black, whatever is the new black, it's all the new black, because the blackness is always there. That is the there that's there. The blackness, which is, the space in which to do all of that work. Yes? Maybe?
I was going to say, or maybe it isn't. Maybe it's exactly the opposite. Maybe that there's a kind of relationship between a kind of evolving or shifting form and an evolving or shifting self. I mean, I think that perhaps the blackness itself is the thing that would be in flux, or the queer subject positioning is the thing that is in flux, which is why to me that it really makes sense, that conversation between form and translation and subject position.
I mean, and maybe it's, but if we're saying that these things are, isn't it always new? Isn't black always new? When is it ever old? You know, and when is it not porous? I find it's interesting to me is, and even this is what brings me back to Bridgefort's work, because that is conceived as sort of a mythic sort of South, right? That's not
It's an invented past.
Right. So there's a way in which that South exists, and that these Souths are being made. And I can't help but think that this idea for the new is a modernist creation. Right, I can't help but think about the way, you know, Eliot and Powell, make it new, and how that became like this American sort of thing we hold to, as though in the new, we have what we didn't have before. And I think that's such a like last 100 years feature, because this wasn't a question prior to that. Maybe it's because black folks wasn't, but I don't even, I'm maybe even the praise song. If we, I mean, like people, I mean, if we even look at the Hazal, people innovated upon it, but nobody was like, fuck the hustle. You know what I mean? And so I just can't help but think about how this idea of newness is it's sort of a besetting of modernism, and something that we have to sort of, it's always new. Like, well, that's just given.
It's important to keep in mind when Pound says make it new, he doesn't mean something that never was there before. I mean, the cantos open with a translation of the Odyssey, and then moves to Sordello and so on and so on. What he's talking about is making that which is already there new.
Let me connect this conversation to the term that I kept using Keith used, which was heritage. And I think, you know,
I thought you said heresy.
I think that that's to me, a pretty interesting and careful way of addressing that question of identity, essence, you know, transhistorical blackness, is to just talk about heritage, which is transmitted, it's translated from generation to generation. So, if it's always new, Roger, what do you think the role of heritage would be in black poetics, or anybody's poetics?
I think heritage, and that, okay, how do we sing heritage? Aesthetic heritages, right?
Well, yeah.
And like, you know, like there's aesthetic heritage, there's the historical, there's the actual, like how you get there, and there's different ways people use. Like I think about Thomas and Beulah as a way of talking about aesthetics and heritage mixing, and then also I think about sort of Bessie Phillips' song as another way of thinking about aesthetics and heritage, right? Because there it's more language movement versus sort of a more, you know, if we think about Thomas and Beulah, we're thinking about more of what I would call, and I don't mean, but more of what we think about the lyric when we're thinking about the lyric. So I think those are two books that are both very invested in heritage, but also very invested in language in much different ways, and interrogating language in the aesthetic sort of landscape of language. So to me, that's... I
mean, thinking about Gershon's presentation, it seems as if, you know, it might be possible to say that one of the things you're doing when you're making it new is inventing a new heritage. You know, that's what Bridgeforth is doing. She's inventing a new past so that she can use language in the way that she wants to in the present moment to make things happen that she wants to have happen performatively on the page.
I think it's also important, I think I might add to that to say, as much as, I mean, if we keep out this idea of right as a form as some kind of translation, then not necessarily is the artist, him or herself, doesn't remain untransformed by using a form. I'm trying to say there's not, okay, how can I explain this? So this idea, let's use the idea of heritage. So let's, however one kind of is imagining that the artist's relationship to heritage, when they kind of incorporate it into their art, I don't think, neither in my mind does the heritage or the artist remain stable in that act of creation. And I'm saying this to say, because what I was hearing is a sense that there's a kind of a stability in terms of artistic creation that and that's kind of what I've heard. I hope that I'm not trying to say someone saying something they didn't say. But part of, I think, what I was trying to get across in my talk is this idea that we can't presume that artistic creation, that a person remains unchanged in the act of creating, right? Once you kind of inhabit the form, you create something. If the idea that you're trying to get across are translated in the process, maybe the artist himself or herself wasn't translated. And I'd say that just to say that it can, this idea of, oh yeah, the question of like blackness, isn't blackness always there? I mean, that's what you're saying isn't always new, but it seems like it's not, maybe not just always being reinvented, but it's not it's not ever in one location, because my blackness might not be your blackness or whatever, or your blackness, right? So the idea that we can't presume that even if there is a there there, that it's always kind of the same there that is there. Sorry.
Yeah.
Like, I guess that's the thing about it not always being new, because there has been in African American studies, and not just in the Black arts movement, you find this tension in Langston Hughes as the Negro artist in the Racial Mountain. Jazz is the tom-tom beating in the Negro soul, so jazz is blackness. And I'm writing these poems out of this thing called blackness, and we have Leroy Jones's famous essay about how the music is the only place that African Americans have expressed themselves. He said the black man's soul, but never mind that. And so the jazz blues tradition has come to dominate African American literary scholarship in a way that
and yet
it becomes.
There's so little of that scholarship about jazz and blues.
It's amazing, isn't it? But you have blues theories.
There's a new book I heard that's supposed to be.
Yeah.
Right.
Excellent new book called
It's called The Muses Music or something. What's the author's name? Joe? But I should say that I'm more invested in a kind of old school notion of blackness than I'm challenging myself with this presentation. But what Thelma Golden and those visual artists talked about with post-black, and Thelma Golden, Joshua and I was talking about this yesterday. Thelma Golden said post-black art, so she was using it to refer to artistry, not to blackness as an ontology. But the notion was that the very thing about my blackness is not the same as your blackness, is not the same as her blackness, which they perceive to be a newly liberating posture among black artists, whereas for a long time in the black tradition, arguably, and I'm not sure where I stand on this, there was more investment in saying that there's a range of things, ways by which you can convey blackness, and my blackness and your blackness have these things fundamentally in common, and we must express that shared fundamental thing in common. And that the difference between then and now is this notion that, well, actually, we don't have to talk about what we share in common, and my blackness can still be my blackness, and your blackness can still be your blackness. And if that difference holds, and I'm not sure if it holds, but if that difference holds, then there is something different about now that allows us to say blackness is always new, where Langston Hughes didn't necessarily feel that way, and Melvin Tolson didn't necessarily feel that way, and et cetera.
You know, this is that sort of has the shape, the form of the debate around the use of the word queer also, right? And does that mean, is that an expansive opening up of previously ossified lesbian and gay and bisexual and transgender identities, or is it itself a kind of homogenizing, repressive, normalizing, flattening out of difference that actually renders invisible again the thing that we had just managed to bring into visibility? So I think that it's going to continue to be a productive tension. You look like you're thinking.
Oh, I am, because the blackness always being there. There's something that I'm just going to reiterate the problem, but something about the notion that the new black, the old black, the post-black, blackness remains as the category by which we're defining what these artists are doing around this category of identity. And so that category of identity remains so much at the center of what we're doing. And it's a fascinating idea because I think I am completely persuaded by the notion that we can't authenticate blackness as any one set of things, and that it is this open porous thing, but yet it does remain there in whatever its many forms are. And so it's interesting to think about what it means that it remains a kind of constant, even if we can't constantly pin it down. So, but that's just more of a thinking out loud than anything else.
Let me just shift the terms of the conversation slightly towards specific forms, because Leslie, I wanted to ask you why you think rhyme's out of fashion. You were sort of saying, well, it's an interesting and mysterious and perhaps suspicious thing, but I can't know. Women aren't using that rhyming poetry, and it's not getting published. So I just wondered what you think what's the paranoid version of what's going on?
Well, the paranoid version would have something to do with the word poetess.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, but maybe a better way of thinking about it is a kind of strong suspicion of closure, and the very strong sonic closure that end rhyme provides, and how antithetical that is to how certainly most contemporary U.S. poets I know define what they're trying to do.
That's the answer.
I would love to hear from some of the poets on the panel and poets from yesterday's panel about whether indeed they feel skeptical and suspicious of end rhyme A, closure B, and other kinds of closure that might come with received forms. Is that it?
I
Is
feel
that right?
skeptical and suspicious of pretty much everything, but to give a non-physical. I'm also wanting to warn Gershon he needs to be careful when he tells people he's working on Fabio.
Okay. Why do you say that?
Because I think you're talking about somebody else.
Oh.
They never heard of her.
I wouldn't worry about that too much.
But yeah, well, she's in fact part of as wonderful a person as she was, and she was a truly generous person, in addition to being an interesting poet. She's an example of the kind of attention that Keith was talking about, because if you remember her comments about Tolson, she pretty much declared that he was not, in fact, writing black poetry.
Right.
That's precisely
a lot of
why I
improv.
went to respond.
Yeah, exactly.
That's precisely why.
But to get back to your question, 80% of the mainstream poetry published in the United States today operates as if, in fact, modernism had never happened. Now, there might be a lot of mention of newness and so forth and so on, but there really is a certain set of safe assumptions that are at the heart of most of the enterprise. Those poets who are in one way or another trying to continue in what we can regard as, I guess, a free verse revolution from the early part of the 20th century have gone through several important stages, and this is one of the reasons I started with this poem that Baraka had written in the 1960s, Duncan Spoke of a Process, because they saw themselves as operating, and here's the similarity to jazz musician, and, as it were, the continuous invention of form. I was just at the Guelph Jazz Festival, and for those of you who aren't familiar with that festival, it's one that puts much greater emphasis on pre-improvisation than some of the more popular festivals like the Playboy Festival and others. But again, as we've been alluding to, there are constraints always in these kinds of creation. In poetry, you've got the constraints of the language you work with, the page, the room you're sitting in, and so forth and so on. If you are a musician, you have the certain constraints of your instrument, which you might expand by different technical means. You might expand the vocabulary beyond the general jazz vocabulary. You might place yourself in different contexts where you're going to create different kinds of things. For example, I saw Craig Taborn playing in a trio with no bass player, with just a saxophone player and a drummer. There was that great innovation in the mid-20th century when Ornette Coleman and others stopped using a piano because they wanted to open themselves up beyond the constraints of traditional harmonics. It did not mean that they were just doing anything, though, because they were working within certain constraints and trying to create new kinds of forms. So the poets that were part of that revolution, say, going from objectivists to the early 1970s, saw themselves as trying constantly to create new form. Now, the difference between them and the poets, say, of my generation was that they were still wedded to an ideal of our organic form. And you see that in this emphasis upon the breath, and I think you see that in the lingering stuff about the jazz and the heart, for example. You know, when a Ginsberg or an Olson or an early Baraka think of themselves as the poem of the record of themselves in a specific time and place, and they think of it very much the same way that abstract expressionists thought of the painting as a field of action where the presence of the artist was still there. That was very strong in that generation of poets, those poets that were maybe born in the 30s and started publishing in the 50s and 60s. That's where the skepticism of my generation really comes in, because we tend to be deeply suspicious of that idea of the poet as being present in that way. Similarly, we tend to be suspicious of that kind of closure. Now, it happens that a lot of these poets wrote in forms all the time. You know, there's that Zukovsky poem that goes on and for page after page using the formula for a conic section to distribute vowel sounds. You know, there's all the syllabic experiments, you know, from Williams's Wheelbarrow poem through Marianne Moore's syllabic stanzas and so forth. Poets are constantly finding new ways to work with form, both orally and visually. And for me, that's the really exciting thing about it. I think the reason that many of us are skeptical isn't with form per se. It's not with end rhyme per se. It's not even with the closing couplet per se. It's with the arguments that are so often advanced around these. So, for example, when the new formalists appear in the 1980s, they don't actually mean what their name implies, because they're only advancing certain kinds of forms, and they're accusing the rest of American poetry of having abandoned that which makes poetry poetry, and so forth. Those arguments don't really stand up to very close inspection, no matter how good the poetry written by people among the New Formalists might be. You could say the same thing about some of the people who are antagonistic to New Formalism on the other side. There are claims that are made, for example, right now for certain kinds of conceptual poetry that just are illogical. But again, to me, the emphasis for me as an artist is that whenever I'm writing a poem, I no longer believe, as Baraka and Creeley and Olson did, that somehow the poem itself is suggesting the form, as if that were waiting to emerge as my hand moved across the page. But I do see myself, and again, these musical analogies are something you should also be suspicious of, but I love them, so I use them all the time. I see myself like an instrumentalist who each time I step up to the microphone, using all the vocabularies that I've been able to acquire over years of practice, is trying out of all that assembled material I have to make a statement that I might not have made a minute before and probably won't make again a minute later, and that someone else in the audience might join me in creating as an audience member. So again, I think the skepticism, at least among most of the poets that I concern myself with, is not in the very idea of these forms, because they're usually interested in retrieving old forms, for example. But again, in the arguments that are made for closing out the rest, or something like that.
Yeah, and you know, a lot. Obviously, there was a part of New Formalism that was about nostalgia, right? Mm-hmm. And also about shutting down the canon again because it was opening up too much. Mm-hmm. You know, that it's a way of, and I think that there have been a series of moves like this. And I've seen people working on eco-criticism and environmental approaches to literature who seem to me to be using it as a way to narrow down the canon again, too, you know, that suddenly, you know, not a lot of poets of color somehow fit into that category, right? You know, and
there's another new book about Black nature.
Yeah.
All right.
Let me no longer defer my long promised opening it out to the audience. Questions, comments from people in the room, including people on yesterday's panel or participants, observers?
Well, I'd like to sort of answer the question that you just posed about being suspicious of end rhyme at all. I'm certainly not suspicious of it, and this question sort of plagues me all the time because when you try to answer it, it inculcates lots of other things like audience, for example. And I think that we kid ourselves as producers of art when we think that things like rhyme and sentimentality don't matter to the potential audiences that we might have. And there was a conversation, I like to call it like the poetry death match between 4 African American poets, Marilyn Nelson, Cyrus Cassell, C.S. Giscombe, and Erica Hunt. And it turned out to be, it was just a sort of afternoon conversation about the obscurity in poetry produced by some African American poets. The two of them sort of separated, where it was Marilyn Nelson and Cyrus Cassell against C.S. Giscombe and Erica Hunt, battling it out. And Erica and Cecil sort of came to the conclusion that it was important to maintain a level of remove in poetry so that it could survive all kinds of commercial attacks, that it would outlast some of the systems that humans have developed to keep ourselves sane. And Marilyn and Cyrus seem to think, well, that's BS, because if the people that really need poetry can't access it because it's at a level of remove, then it's not valuable at all. And so I think just as a practical tool that we cannot lose things like end rhyme and I sort of more importantly than rhyme and meter are things that I always hear talked about in the academy as a negative aspects of art, like sentimentality. I think sentiment is very important It's important to the artist producing the work, and I think it's an active denial to try to get rid of it in art. And I think that's something that's come out of modernism in particular. But yeah, so I think I would say that not all contemporary poets are suspicious of that. Maybe contemporary poets with more allegiances to the academy and what it means to have a very healthy intellectual diet, which I'm in favor of, are suspicious of it. But I don't necessarily know if that's a ubiquitous thing. And Alden, I would really be interested to know, you said 80% of the poetry produced in the country is...
The number I pulled out of my butt.
Right, okay. I just wanted confirmation.
As you might guess, I read an awful lot of poetry. I've been to an awful lot of poetry readings, probably more than is even healthy, because I just love poetry. But as a result, I'm in the middle of this swirl. I've heard that argument you're just talking about, for 30, 40 years now. I probably was hearing it before that and just didn't recognize it because I was too young. But I've always found these arguments puzzling. People are always talking about what may or may not be accessible for someone who's not in the room. And I find that troubling. I wasn't born an academic. I wasn't born into an academic family. I wasn't, weaned on a diet of Latin and Greek. What did Olson say? Hath not the opportunity or something. The advantage, that's what he said. I always found poetry to be one of the most democratically available arts in all its forms that there is.
It's cheap.
Yeah, I did not in fact sleep with dictionaries, but I discovered early on that when I encountered something I didn't understand, I didn't have to pay anyone to find out what it was. I already gave a little speech, so I'll stop here, but I can't, I'm a big Tolson fan. The other person I would have talked about if we didn't have the slides was Tolson, but I can't help remembering, Tolson used to tell his students at Wiley College all the time. He said, you know where the white man hides stuff he doesn't want you to know? The library.
All right, let's take one more question and then we'll close out with another round of, a brief round of reading. Yes.
I want to make sure no one else has a question first because I can.
Yes, Nandini.
Yes, I have a question about the relationship between blackness and language, and especially where English is a privileged language, right? So if we're really talking about translating African American poetry into languages which are not French, which are not Spanish, which are not Portuguese, so what exactly do you think, in terms of your thought, that what part of blackness, and especially in terms of that new black, post-black, do you want to be translated into a language which has a very historically relationship of domination with English? So, my introduction to African American poetry wasn't through any of the power languages, right? So I think think about that question a lot.
Wow. Say something. I heard a couple of things in your question. The first, it's this idea of kind of how the relationship to English in this and how we think we might also think about the kind of translation of blackness in other languages, and then the other, I lost the other piece, but I think if I talk through it, I'll get to it. But I hope this gets to your question. I want to say that part of what I was trying to say with this metaphor is that isn't so much that I don't think my point is necessarily language specific. I was trying to say maybe we can think about poetic form itself, regardless of the language we're talking about. There's a piece I remember now, as a way that ideas get worked into art, so that I think it is have potential to be taught to use it and not just English. Although I'm like an English language critic. But the other piece you're talking about blackness and blackness in this relationship to this idea of kind of translating blackness into using to bring Audre Lorde into it, like the master tools, right? Using English, this kind of language of colonialism and oppression, to talk about this subject position as being necessarily problematic, or arguably problematic.
I think I heard Nandini saying something like, if you're going to translate a Tolson poem into Hindi, what do you need to get into Hindi that will convey the blackness? Something like that, right? Yeah, Harriet.
Well, I'm not sure if this is on point, but I've had the experience recently of corresponding with someone who is Brazilian, who's translating parts of my work, Muse and Drudge, into Brazilian Portuguese. And it's not the language, because he's bilingual in English and in Portuguese, but it's the cultural references and it's the popular culture that he has trouble. If you say Oreos in English, what will be the equivalent for Brazilian? You know, if you say double Dutch darkies take kisses back to Africa, and do you know that kisses are also chocolate candies? You know, do you know that double Dutch refers to slavery as well as to a process of cocoa? You know, making cocoa. So those are the kinds of things. It's more allusiveness, cultural allusion, and references that were difficult, not so much language per se.
It's never going to be the same thing, I would say. Like, this translation of your work is never necessarily going to be identical to Muse and Drudge in English. Like, I think, and this is scholars of translation talk about how, like, you can think about a translation as its own thing. That is kind of the reworking of the original text, but when you translate it, it becomes something totally different. And you can understand it as another kind of approximation of the idea the original text was trying to approximate, but there's always going to be a disconnect and kind of a lapse, or like Brent Edwards, like the decalage, like the little difference is always going to be there.
Well, given that that's true, which I think was sort of the premise of your question, can blackness be translated?
Well, especially, I'm thinking about the non-European languages.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, your question almost assumes we're talking about U.S. blackness.
That's why I'm...
Yeah. She said African American.
I know, but
yeah.
Yeah.
No, I was just saying that non-European, that's when I think that French, it's easier to translate. It's Spanish, it's easier to translate. Even Dutch, that's going to be easier. But I'm thinking about Hindi, right? And if you think about any of the subcontinental languages, any of the Southeast Asian languages.
I'm curious about this because I'm aware of many Chinese translations, for example, but I don't actually know how many Black Americans have been translated into Hindi. I'd be interested in knowing that.
I mean, there are a lot, and there was recently a project to certainly translate African American poets into Bengali. There's anthologies that exist there. I've worked on some translations from Bengali poets into English, as well as the Bengali poets, contemporary Bengali poets translating contemporary. I mean, very, very recently, one of Don Martin's poems has been translated to Bengali, Elizabeth Alexander. So it's a process that's happening in the world, and I think the question that you bring up is very, very important. How is that done? What is the value of trying to translate that? Is that, for example, the question I have that arises is, are those references that code blackness the most important thing in the poem for the poet, for example? And would a poet say, no, I would like you not to translate my work because I don't think you can communicate those things, I think.
I would also add that the components, there are so many ways of talking about blackness. And so we have the allusiveness, the cultural references, and I'm trying to, his face is in front of me and I can't think of his name, but he talked in a panel at the Kalaloo 30th anniversary conference about blackness being a condition of fugitivity. And so that one way to capture blackness in translation would be to capture the kind of subaltern position of the African Americans in the United States. If you're talking about American blackness, United States blackness, which still doesn't separate you or absolve you from trying to figure out how to get the cultural allusiveness, but for some poets, to take a Langston Hughes, capturing that posture of the relationship to the imperial culture, I think is another way of capturing something that we might call blackness.
Something I think I've been pushed to think about, partly because of my graduate training, which is the material of the translation. And we receive these things in books. It's not like there's like a translation that appears in the heavens and we see it and we see translate. You know, so I always think about like Phyllis Wheaton and the way in which she sort of marks her text with her physical visage on the front of the text. And I think about the markers of African American translated and thinking about those moments as a way of entering when we're looking at the cover of the book, when we're turning the pages of the book, what we know we are encountering. And I think that also is part of the translation. is that in the title? Is that, you know, where are there pictures next to these, you know, because I think that ultimately we're talking about a type of visibility. And visibility in a way that's very basic, like these people, we haven't encountered this work necessarily before, so there's very like basic sort of things that can make this process a little different.
Now I'm ready to ask a question that relates to the conversation that's been circulating, and I actually want to ask it for a poet in the room who's been silent throughout this, I think both respectfully or modestly, and that's a poet who I know makes a point of both stating and doing work that's been influenced by African American poetry, but whose scholarship, as well as poetry, is deeply influenced by being in Texas, and that's Deborah Bradis. And so I really would like to hear from her weighing in on some of these questions, in part because I know that both formally, it's rare that you get poets who are, it is rare to find poets when they talk about influences or lineage, you're talking about kind of, Keith in your paper said the thing about post-black, and I started thinking before I wanted to hear what Deborah had to say, how would it shift if you just said post-racial instead of post-black? How would that change, you know, the claims and, you know, the brilliant presentation you did? And so I wanted to hear from someone who does what is rare, who acknowledges an influence not only by kind of those kind of African American poets that have passed, but contemporary Black poets, right? You don't usually see that in a cross-cultural bilingual sense. So.
I really share Keith's need to convince himself to let go of an old school Black, because I feel similarly with regards to both Latino sort of identifications, and yet I share a kind of investment in old school Black, you know. The particular kind of struggles and fugitivity that's sort of implicit in that. I agree that it's both the there that we can't pin down and always the thing we have to somehow reckon with. And so for me, I think that the thing I find most compelling and most exciting about contemporary Black poetics are folks, you know, even who are taking up form because in the same way that they're taking up Blackness in ways that are kind of, you know, using, I mean, even someone like, you know, Frank Wade, who's actually going ahead and saying, let me just wrestle with this form, but I need to do it in a way that's actually, you know, speaking to the future by taking up this new history, you know, a history that needs to be told. Whether, you know, Sharon's doing it in, I think, super exciting ways, right? By, as you said, Joshua, being able to invent the past that we haven't, you know, the South that we haven't actually been able to be granted, right? But I think that for me, people like, you know, who are invested, I'm actually excited in folks who are actually invested in doing the interesting things with traditional forms. I mean, like, really basically, that's where my own poetics is. I think I've learned actually more from contemporary Black folks who are doing it than I have, I think, even from some other of my fellow Latinos, because I think that that's something that's happening that I'm really excited by. That, you know, I'm not a poetry scholar, I'm a performance scholar, so for me, I'm totally interested as a poet, you know, and I'm learning from the poems, as I always have, I think, because of my own training in poetry. So, you know, I think for me, that's how I can speak to it as a poet. You know, I came to Sharon's work as a performance scholar. So for me, I think it's exactly right that need to speak to those particular neithers necessitated the performance novel poem thing that it is both, that it is and is both beyond. But beyond that, I mean, I'm happy to talk more, but I really was wanting to just, you know, take this one.
So before, I don't want us to have a sort of inelegant shoving out by the HRC. I want to make sure that we end in a timely way. So let's ask just for a couple of lines from all the panelists as a sort of valedictory moment of our time together this afternoon. If you just want to read something or speak something short from the poem that you thought about. And maybe we'll go Roger to Alden.
Okay.
I'm going to give you a moment.
Well, should I go ahead while he's looking?
Okay, go ahead.
It'll be more than a couple. I was following the instructions that was given.
Yeah, I'm giving you some new instructions. So.
This is titled In a Class with Baraka. It's from 1979. In the end, then, to a room half hangs outside, the hall trashed, overheated. Pupils smart, squirm in dust, ashes add up under chairs, motes streaming cling to blinking lids. An odor of investment accrues to this room. English beats against the glass, shadowing through the panes upon the table, obstructing paths of passing planes. The capital's accumulation of images in the mute wavering grain is something we dissect, practicing between ourselves the removal of harmful forms. Head at the window scarring the glass, meaning glazes over the watching White House. Beating back, American artist in residence in the new Department of Corrections planes the blades of our speech, asks examples. Mine is of a piece with a room at an end that hangs outside in essential popular air. Mine is of a flight that exclaims, fingers against the glass. I check my watch, prepared to give examples.
Theories of
all kinds of notes on it.
Theories of Time and Space from Natasha Trethewey. You can get there from here, though there's no going home. Everywhere you go will be somewhere you've never been. Try this. Head south on Mississippi 49, 1 by 1 mile markers ticking off another minute of your life. Follow this to its natural conclusion. Dead end at the coast, the pier at Gulfport, where riggings of shrimp boats are loose stitches in the sky threatening rain. Cross over the man-made bridge, 26 miles of sand dumped on the mangrove swamp, buried terrain of the past. Bring only what you must carry, tome of memory, its random blank pages. On the dock where you board the boat for Ship Island, someone will take your picture. The photograph, who you were, will be waiting when you return.
Before I read my poem, I'm going to pass something around. This is a notebook that's going back to the University of Auckland. They give visiting poets this thing called a tapa notebook. What they ask you to do is fill it up somehow and send it back. So I'm keeping the first half as a writer's notebook, and the second half from the back inward, I'm asking every poet I meet to sign it and write one line of poems, of poetry that sings in your head. So as many people who'd be willing to do that, that would be great. All right, one shortish poem from my most recent poetry collection, Heterotopia. And I was writing these poems, which are about Liverpool, England in the 40s and 50s, at the same time that I was writing the last scholarly book, which is about voice, sound, and performance in American poetry. So it's called Oral Culture. In my classroom, there are 9 windows full of mountains, but 8 of the windows are painted shut. We mispronounce words on purpose and draw little marks over them, spears and cups and kisses. In my classroom, accent and sibilance, thump and stagger, chalk and analog. I am paid to say formula, copia, and residue, and I am happy to say them, work and joy and religion. My grandmother had a song for her name, and a song for driving home, and a song for childish love, but my children will not learn them. My mother has a story for school clothes, and a story for sherry, and a story for wicked teachers, but my children want me to read to them from heavy books, the voices climbing up and down the scale, roughened by humors. It is all good, pages and timbers, classrooms and mothers, but something is lost. Or it is losing, loss of steam, loss of capital, loss of confidence, power. I remember dialects changing as the blender word, suitcases emptied, suitcases packed, homemade ice cubes and powder for whiskey sours. Not that people were kinder, they were bitter. The lemony foam flattened quickly, as if bubbles were more delicate then, thinner walled. Listen to the foam of my voice, and I will pour it for you. All the tiny stories in one intoxicating stream, catching each other's sparkle, now, before the taste disappears.
So I'm going to just go back and read part of the final section that I read before, just to hear it again. Because I just like, I like to hear stuff over and over again, so just so you get to hear it again. For all time, I'm yours, I'm yours. They quit the rails, open shop, selling charms and things right here in the front yard. They give us poetry for free. and even us that make our own charms, stop by, because some days you just need a poem.
Fishhead for Katrina by Terrence Hayes. The mouth is where the dead who are not dead do not dream. A house of damaged translations. Task married to distraction. As in a bucket left in a storm. Acquired singing in the rain like fish. Acquiring air underwater. Prayer and sin the body performs to know it is alive, lit from the inside by reckoning. As in a city which is no longer a city. The tongue reaching down a tunnel and the teeth wet as windows. Set along a highway where the dead live in the noise of their shotgun houses. They drift from their wards like fish spreading thin as a song diminished by its own opening. Split by faith and soaked in it. The mouth is a flooded machine.
Round of applause to our panel.